Participants can now see. All right, right, fine. Now, no, thank you. Well, I'd like to say that I know this was pre-internet, but that doesn't excuse the modern authors of some of these operating manuals from not passing on adequate information, because the reader may not actually know or have the experience and the knowledge of the right terms, probably a long-term DXer. Of course, one of the chapters was on DX working, and we hopefully will get the next slide up here. No? You got a problem?
Yeah, it's gone again.
Oh, yeah. Well, all right, we're back on there. Okay, there were 5 diagrams in this book for the month of October, and they give an indication from where the signals could be heard, and they were time related, 0600, 800, 1200, 1600, and 2000. And the example I've chosen is the 0600 one. And that's because it shows the day-night thing. You can see the hatched contour that's around the left-hand side of the drawing. Of course, these are the best possible indications of where the signals would come from, but the sequence of diagrams were accompanied by a commentary giving advice on where the operator signal could reach. Now, I'm not going to go into details, obviously, except to say they were very instructive. The propagation contours for Britain, this is, were based on a sunspot count of 100. I know we haven't got there yet. Also, it should be noted that efficient antennas were needed to match up the predictions, because that's what they were predictions. There's just one small problem. Although I'd been operating maritime mobile for some years, I'd started operating from South Africa for about 6 months a year. And apparently nobody published any research or DX operating from the ZS. At least I never heard of any experienced operator who could recall such mapping. And there was an even bigger problem, a bigger general problem really, because operators hardly ever point their beams down to Africa unless they're looking for a particular DXpedition. Initially, my station sported a multi-band vertical on a large tin roof. And since then, I've graduated to 2 towers, and we have Yagis through from 40 meters to 10 meters. And nowadays, we're totally solar powered. Even now, there's no electricity on in the town at the moment. And even when both stations are running, we can manage if there's a blackout. However, in the manual, there was a small section on the North Californian DX Foundation beacons, and that was my starting point. Developing my operating practice down here, and Sue's made a copy of the complete section. That was it. Whilst you look at the slide showing the old beacon schedule, I should point out that all my talks are scripted, so I don't go off at a tangent, which Susan thinks I do sometimes, and I'm liable to do that actually. It does mean though that I can always repeat something if I'm asked. So I hope that when you see the video that's at the end of this presentation, you'll have another way to identify in which direction propagation lies and on which band between 2010 signals can be heard. Of course, one way to check is to scan the bands for signals and then try to call the DX station. And that's what hams used to do. Some would monitor DXpeditions published list of frequencies. Pre-internet, these were always published in Radcom, CQ magazine, and lots of others. And there are still some avid DXers who subscribe to Bernie's Daily DX newsletter. Nowadays, several operators are glued to the cluster, but they can only show a fraction of the stations on the air. And there have been several FT4 and FT8 days recently. It's an absolute cracking opening on 10 meters on Saturday. Yesterday was poor and today was absolutely dreadful. But sometimes when working a pileup, my call will not appear on the cluster. And at other times it'll come up after I've gone QRT. But there is a method, a simple method, that's been around a lot longer than all those technical wonders. It was revolutionary in its inception. and has been the biggest contribution to hams that are interested in working DX on the HF bands, of course, and for almost half a century, would you believe? Not surprisingly, it uses radio. Now, in 1972, DX California Foundation, or the North California DX Foundation Board, decided they wanted to expand their operation in a scientific way. They wanted to further their work than just assisting the expeditions with equipment and support. And of course, they still do that. But man had landed on the moon, and hams were still chasing DX the hard way. They appealed to their scientific advisor, that's Dr. Mike Villard, W6QIT at Stanford University. Could he help them with their quest? Well, Mike had a friend who was working with floating maritime beacons that gave out radio signals on a project connected with SAR, that's Maritime Search and Rescue. The plan was for these beacons to be used to monitor currents so that it would give emergency services data that would enable them to track drifting vessels that had got into difficulties. Okay, so how is this related to amateur radio? Well, Mike arranged for one of these beacons to be switched on. It was operating on 20 meters and it was situated in Washington, DC. And a group of the foundation members were listening, as well as being connected in contact with each other on 2 meters locally. The 25 watt signal was heard quite well, and even the 1 watt was copyable. So the idea was formed. Beacons running on 20 meters, 14.100 megahertz around the world would contribute to scientific knowledge and be available for operators to hear. There was just one snag. These marine beacons were costing $25,000. And just to give you some idea, in modern terms, that's about £130,000 ago. So this was well outside the foundation's budget. And what do? Well, they thought, we'll draft in some of the people from Oscar 1 to 5 satellites, sorry, 1 to 4 satellites. And one of them was Chuck Town's K6LFH. And after a short series of meetings, they came up with a unique but brilliant idea. Well, I think it was brilliant and still use it. It would be a worldwide beacon system where each beacon transmitted for 1 minute in sequence using the same message format. Mike, W6QIT, would make a very innovative suggestion that each beacon's signal went down in 10 dB steps at the end of each of its transmissions. But then came the reality again, who was going to design and build these beacons? Then Chuck Bounds brought in Jim Winnett, that's K6OPO, and he's quite a well-known designer and builder from the Project Oscar. And it's all very well, though, to have it all sorted like they did, but it's one obvious thing missing. They had to find a beacon or get a beacon license from the FCC. Unfortunately, the guy who was in charge of the amateur section at that time was Mr. Prowse Walker. He was an amateur, W4WB, and he encouraged the foundation and even arranged for them to meet with groups that were planning to present papers to Walk 79. And the foundation has recognized his encouragement as fundamental to the success of the project. Well, during the submissions to the FCC, the foundation had to give an undertaking that the prototype beacon in California would be monitored 24 hours a day. And they would supply the FCC with the names and contact particulars of hams who were detailed to listen. You see, unattended remote operation was a long way away from being approved in any country. So the first one looks like this. It was in a trailer overlooking Stanford University. Now, British people call this a caravan or a static van anyway. Calls went out mainly through magazines for hams to send in reports, and signals heard, and the uptake was very good. Now, this is before the internet, so you've got to remember that most of the reports came in were faxed or telephoned or sent in the good old postal system. And you must remember, the only accepted method in those days was of confirming contacts were QSL cards. And of course, most countries had a postal system that worked effectively, not like today. So here's of the original unit. And after 2 years of operation in California, the foundation were ready to look for potential locations in other parts of the world. So with the recruitment of Dave Leeson, W6QHS, designs are finalized and production started because they needed another 9. The design was centered on a TS120 with a phasing unit designed by Mike Stahl, K6NYC, who I talked to, well, most weeks anyway. And in those days, he was in KLM antennas. He was the M in KLM antennas, you see. But as an aside, the TS120 operated 24/7 for over 10 years on 20 meters before any replacement. And here's the antenna. It's an ordinary, bog standard, quarter-wave vertical. Anyway, almost immediately they got this sorted, the original got sorted. They spoke to other people, and Dr. Max de Hessler, HB9RS of the United Nations, and Marty Lane, OH2 Bravo Hotel, and several others promised to get a beacon up in their jurisdiction or their organization or their country. And the beacon messages have gone out on 14100 since the 1980s. And here's a map of the beacon. The sites have changed a little bit, like the Canadian site is a lot further south, well, about 1,000 miles further south, but most of them are in the same place, or fairly close. And this is a computer drawing by Sue. She does all the graphics for our books, and she also does all the soldering at ZT1T. That's the special call sign for our station. Anyway, before moving on, I'd like to mention that during some RTTY contests, operators interfere with the beacon frequency 14100, that's CW. Even though it's been part of the regulations for many years, non-beacon operation in the beacon band is against every country's regulation, and even regular messages posted on the cluster to desist are ignored by those who are uncaringly inconsiderate. And a couple of days ago, I found an SSB conversation spilling over onto the 18 megahertz beacon frequency. And today, this afternoon, I heard 2 operators on 21150, we'll come to that in a moment, holding a QSO. It sounded like Russian. But anyway, let's get back to 1984. The then Secretary of Region 2, and that gentleman's name was Alberto Chayo. His call sign was Hotel Kilo 3 Delta United. He recognized the success of the 20-meter project, and he proposed a new worldwide beacon system. The walk bands had been given to amateurs at Walk 79, and the new name was to be, wait for it, the North California DX Foundation International Amateur Radio Union International Beacon Project. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, to say the least. But the big step forward was that beacons would not only operate in a time-sharing mode, they'd operate in a band-orientated schedule. And of course, the even bigger question was, who would design and build the new beacons, never mind solving the synchronization aspect of shorter transmissions to fit in with all the new beacons. The foundation members kicked this around till about 1988. This was when Bob Fabry, November 6 Echo Kilo, retired professor of computer science at the University of California, got involved with Dave, again, W6QSH, and they worked to develop the system as it is today. There was a discussion about time duration, which listened when listening to the beacons, and considering that was quite far-sighted, the foundation and the executive member of the Region 2 of the IARU accepted the 12-second version of each CW message, but Bob Fabry, obviously a computer guy, investigated several possibilities and realized the time span for each transmission should be 10 seconds for practical reasons, because when all the beacons are operational, there are 18 beacon messages over a 3-minute period. Kenwood donated 16 TS50s to the new multiband project, and on each of them was a plaque commemorating Jim Rafferty. That's November 6 Radio Japan. Went silent key in 1993, and as everybody would know at that time, he was Mr. Radio Shack and supported the project from its inception. So distribution of the new beacons ran until the late 1995, or from late 95 to September 96. And finally, each beacon's signal has the same format. Now, I'm going to say this again sometime later, but the call sign is at 100 watts, 22 words a minute. Then there are 4 DARs. The first DAR is at 100 watts. The second DAR is at 10 watts. The third DAR is at 1 watt. And the fourth DAR is at 0.1 watt. Now, I will remind you of that later when we come towards the video. As you can see, the additional frequencies were allocated, and they are 18110, 21150, 24930, and 28200. Yes, I mentioned, yes, I know I have missed out 14100 because you've said that before. Okay. After that, after each beacon has sent its message, there's a silence period, and before it starts, it's synchronized emissions again. It took some time for this easily accessible system to be up and running, but it's the best now system for checking the one aspect you can't do without: propagation. The reverse beacon network, RBN, might fill that gap eventually, but that means more operators are prepared to leave their equipment running unattended and attached to the internet. Fortunately, present-day hams, fortunately for us anyway, modern hams, every computer login program has a facility that allows operators to monitor propagation in 2 ways. The login program I use is Logger 32. So these are the examples from my screen. The first slide shows concentrating on a single ham, and you can see the blue square, by the way, shows the active beacon. This may mean changes of azimuth if you're checking each of the beacons. Those with the directional antennas, it's not a simple requirement. I promise you that I've tried it. Of course, many operators with directional antennas like V-beams would only be looking at a particular spread of bearings, unless of course you had an omnidirectional antenna. But most amplifiers, modern amplifiers, have inputs for several antennas, and my expert also has a facility that the radio that isn't being used is on a listening antenna. And the second slide that we show you is where you're concentrating on one beacon. Then the transceiver will have to hop from band to band and possibly antenna to antenna and follow the transmissions. Now with CAT, on most modern rigs, that's easily done. Now, if you want to just monitor the beacons, there are lots and lots of programs. Probably the most popular one is Pharos by V3NEA. That's from Afrit Software. We all know things like those programs, they run from there. But if you want any apps at all to monitor the beacons, they can be found at the nxdxf.org website. I'll leave that up so you can actually make a note of it if you'd like. With the return of propagation, this facility enabled me to respond to a recent 17-meter and 12-meter request from Yankee Bravo 4 Fox Echo. I replied to Freddie on email, of course, making him listen for the ZS beacon on 70 meters, and I would look and listen for the Victor radio beacon, the Victor Radio 2, that is. The ZS6 beacon is some distance away from ZS1, and of course the VR2 beacons in Hong Kong and Freddie's in Indonesia, but they're our nearest beacons. So with propagation picking up, I heard the Hong Kong beacon, so I emailed him and we had a sched. The following day, listening for the beacons on 12 meters, with the beam pointing east, I could just hear the Victor Radio 2 Bravo beacon, and then I was called by ZS1AFS. Eventually, with him pointing to Europe and me pointing north, we had a catch-up sched, a catch-up QSO, and by then, the beacon on Hong Kong was coming in quite well. So I emailed Freddie, and we had our 12-meter QSO completed with pleasantries as well as reports. Now, I'm very lucky, I suppose, because I'm able to monitor 2 bands at the same time. Having filters avoids the other rig from being wiped out, but I can still only manage to do 1 regular contest band and 1 walk band. We all know propagation goes in cycles and we're supposed to be on the up, but I'd like to remind you of the words of John Troster, that's Z6AFS. He was actively involved in the project from the start. This was written in 1994, so it's a fair old time ago, and was included in the 1997 CQ Almanac. Those who remember might say it's an echo from the past, so here's the quotation. We are grateful to the universities, national societies, and individuals who have volunteered to operate the beacons in this expanded network. It'll be interesting to monitor the beacons during the increase in HF band activity as the sunspot cycle passes through its minimum and begins to climb back to DX glory. And that's what it looks like we're doing today. But before showing the video, I'd like to tell you how I came by the beacon prototype photographs. Also, it'll give you time to copy the frequencies from the slides Sue is about to show. You might hear them during the video. That's right, you might hear them during the video, so you could write them down if you like. Also, these are the beacons that I listen to on a regular basis. Well, after writing the original article, because originally I did an article for Radcom, I emailed Glenn, Whiskey Zero Golf Juliet. He's the longest serving director on the of the foundation, and asked if there was a photograph of the original beacon. Well, Glenn passed it on to Ross, K6 Golf Fox Juliet, and he's the foundation's historian and librarian. And you can imagine my surprise the next day, those 3 pictures arrived in my email. I was absolutely delighted. And as Ross wrote, thank goodness I labeled the photos on my hard drive, a lesson we all should learn, I think. Anyway, the date of capture was September, where are we? September 1987, and he and Ron, W6VG, went up and did a routine site visit. And the photographs can now be seen on the foundation's website with other disasters that happened. Some of those antennas look quite mangled. And all ham radio operators are invited to support the continuing work of the foundation. As I say, you can find it on the website. Just before Sue runs the video, I'd like to say I hope it shows how easy it is to know in which direction propagation is. At the risk of repetition, I'd like to remind you again of one particular aspect. The dials at the end descend in power. The first one is 100 watts, then 10 watts, then 1 watt, and finally 1/10 of a watt. That should help give you an audio picture of the propagation, but only at that time. These are the 10-meter beacons from the afternoon of the 30th of March 2020, and this was when I first started preparing a presentation. What I hope the video will demonstrate is a modernized old adage in ham radio. If you can hear a beacon, you can work stations in the area of that beacon, but only at that time. You may see the times in the box, but these are not as important as copying the CW. Finally, I should apologize for the movement of the camera. It's about the size of a packet of fags. So, and we don't have a tripod. Now, if anybody wanted one again, please ask, but I would make a request. Please don't do what somebody did during when we started running the video. This person said, I can't hear anything, because you might miss the first CW call sign, and you have to listen carefully because the first ones are very light and very light again. The blue light, by the way, shows where the beacon is active. Whether you receive it or not, another story. Anyway, let's see if we got the video. Yeah. And that's basically it, folks. So finally, to thank Andy for the invitation, and more importantly, Sue for getting the presentation together and all the things she does in the station. And also a big thank you to all for listening. And as Bugs Bunny says, that's all, folks.
Well, thanks very much, Tom, and to you, Sue. That was extremely interesting. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments. If you do, if you unmute yourself, and then feel free to ask any questions or make any relevant comments. Peter.
Yeah, it was very interesting indeed, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us, Tom, and to your ex-file. It's something that I've been aware of beacons, but I have not really used them very much. But I am encouraged to pay more attention to it. I must admit that I'm a low band operator during the winter months, and I do use a reverse beacon network quite a lot on 160 meters. But this does open up the possibility of being able to get a better idea of what is happening to the band, because at the moment propagation time does shift. I find a lot on 20 meters in the morning time when I'm working friends in Australia and New Zealand. And sometimes the peak of the propagation is quite short-lived. So I will be paying more attention to the beacons, Tom. So thanks for that.
Good.
Any
I think,
questions? Oh,
yeah, I was going to make a point. I think it's not so much a question, but I think it's a valid lesson to be learned. I think there are a lot of people who have grown up in the digital world more than the analog world, who probably don't think of beacons and their use and how well they are, how good they are as a measure of propagation. I think it's. I mean, when I was living in Germany, I used to use the VHF beacons a lot as well. So I could talk back to the UK on VHF as well. I did have HF capability, but it was just another string to the bow. But it's something I haven't done for an awful long time, and I guess we all fall into that trap of there are other. Should I say, internet-related ways of finding out rather than actually using the RF, as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk. So an excellent reminder, and something that I think people new to the hobby might find a useful string to their bow.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. Yeah, the interesting thing is, as nobody points the beam down here, it's one way I can know that my signal's going to get there, by hearing the beacons. And also it has a lovely advantage in the afternoon when it's really hot and there's not much on. I can leave the beacons running and I can have a lie down and I can hear them in the house.
Soporific.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add is that so many people will listen to a band and not hear any signals and are not bothered about add a CQ call. Done it myself, so I know that very often you put out a call or a few calls and you will prompt some activity on what would appear to be a dead band. So it's always worth bearing that one in mind as well.
If weekdays are dead bands because people have to work or they're doing something else. But this is one way of being certain that you know you've got propagation to that area.
Yes, that is the great thing about the beacons, yes.
Right.
Well, I think that was an excellent talk. Thank you so much. Very good.
Yeah, well, as long as you enjoyed it, and any questions on qrz.com, by all means, give us a shout, okay? And
I'll tell you what,
bid you
Tom.
good luck.
I'll tell you what, Tom, just before you go, Eckersley's book is on the next floor on the bookshelf as I go in through the door. So I'm very tempted to get Eckersley's book out again and just reread that section. So thanks very much. Take care.
Well, having read the latest offering, it's not a patch on that book, but I even went into all the things that a new ham should know. If they didn't know before, they could read it there. Anyway, the local time here is 10:10, so I'm going to say night-night, and thank you very much for being there. Bye.
Thank you very much,
Cheers.
Tom.
Good night, Tom.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Tom. Take care. All the best.
Right.